Within Kasai, the earliest recorded and or perhaps the most primitive recorded expressions of what we understand today as a supreme deity would have been referred to as Ngan, Mbumba and Nzungumanga. Later to follow, possibly after the 17th century, were supreme deity names and components such as Ifele, Mukulu, Leza and Kalumba. This was a result of populations expanding from Baluba states in the east. These expressions for a supreme deity with its components provide us a great guide to the origins of Sungu and Shongo within Kasai, if we factor in how conquest a lot of the time comes with the new term for God and its components. We can briefly summarize from around the 16th to 17th century, the earliest invading Europeans would have already established alliances on the west coast of Africa up to Angola. From this point, there were various coastal terms for God referred to as Nzambe. This term, with some of its variations, would be expanded into its nearby interiors in conjunction with a Christian Catholic doctrine as part of conquest. This conquest would have been influenced by trade, and the trade would formulate a trade language that incorporates foreign phrases and words that are away from the locality of the trading hub. It is important to understand the leads of this trade are usually the entities who are dominating and controlling commerce. For instance, during the Atlantic slave trade, various entities would ensure control of the coasts, as control of the coast will undoubtedly lead to the control in commerce, power and prestige, and the controller of the coast would lead the political structure, which imposes their term for a supreme deity, including cultural or political structures associated with that deity. As trade reached inland from the 17th century, various opportunists and leads of trade and commerce would be reported to have ventured into or helped developed inland states or kingdoms. The British Museum agents implied the original Baluba within the vicinity of the Kuba kingdom were invaded by Sudanese populations who introduced a throwing knife called Shongo. The problem with this narrative is that allegations of conquering did not come accompanied with a name for God. An interesting point to this for those who watch parts 4, many populations conquered and absorbed into the Kuba kingdom still had their own term for God and can still speak their own language. However, there are no traces of a Sudanic-based term for God within the Kuba kingdom. Similar to how I demonstrated in parts 5, those in possession of sharp objects took on the title of the object or a principle associated with the object. In this case, those chiefs who pledged alliance to the Kuba kingdom, irrespective of their ethnic group, would have been gifted the title or possessed a throwing knife known as Shongo, which means they became a Shongo. Though it's presented these knives were made by Sudanese populations, there's also reference of populations within the vicinity of the Kuba kingdom making these throwing knives, and they used it as currency opposed to a weapon. This leaves room for the possibility of trade resulting in other populations making these throwing knives. Some Baluba Songe groups bear the name Sanga, which potentially came from a corrupted pronunciation of a Baluba group known as Shankadi. Shankadi may have been later pronounced as Sangadi or Sangali, which became Sanga for short. One of these Baluba Songe groups, known as Sanga, were followers of prominent 19th century Songe rulers, who the British Museum agents later categorized as Batetela. These groups raided as far as south within today's Sankuru district. The patrons of this group later became known as Sanga and more so Sungu, who unconsciously adopted the title Batetela when they settled south within today's Tetela Sankuru district. They collectively became the patrons of the Sankuru district, with a Baluba Songe chief known as Banyamutombo. Another ruler who seemed to be the successor or co-ruling with Banyamutombo was referred to as Mukanzi, who the Europeans recognized as a chief of the Sungu. It is not clear where this chief came from, but what is known, he came from a river route which runs past the Kuba kingdom regions, which means he could have been a Shongo, considering the invading Europeans had great relations with the Bakuba, and the invading Europeans had since installed their allies as chiefs. Furthermore, it is possible the Sungu applied the title Mukanzi to the new chief, which is the naming order that can be traced to the Baluba in the Baluba homeland. Collectively, Sungu's arrival in Sankuru was reported to have displaced another Baluba Songe group known as Dempa, or a group related to them. It would appear following the settlement of Banyamutombo and the Sungus is the same moment a new term for God appeared within the Sankuru district. Coincidentally, it was Unyashungu, and sometimes pronounced Onyashongo amongst those more inland within the Sankuru district. Respectively, this term seems to be around an early 20th century invention, because when the British Museum agents published the first study on the so-called Batetela, which was released in the early 20th century, there was not one mention of Shungu or Shongo as a component for God. The British Museum agents only reported the term God as Winya, which also means sun, to imply worship of the sun. A later reported breakdown of Unyashungu was said to mean Father of Heaven, which I respectively disagree with. I respectively see this breakdown to be explained from a religious perspective, which refrains from emphasizing on the term Winya. In fear, it sounds like the sun is being worshipped. I stand to be corrected, but Father of Heavens would simply be Shia Ulungu, which doesn't exactly parallel to Unyashungu. Do note, Tetela culture had affinities with birds, and they will sometimes use the term Mfudu Ulungu, which means birds of heaven. As states this highlights, the letter L within Ulungu was not displaced to describe birds of heaven. The term Unyashungu, which is reported as Father of Heaven, displaces the letter L. I argue the phrase Unyashungu was introduced by the Sungu speaking Tetela. My explanation considers they would have come from a state of war and conquest in the east of Congo, finding sometimes themselves and their surroundings in a state of slavery. The sun would have been symbolic of a mighty force which would have also been responsible for one's destiny and freedom. The freedom components of this would be described as Shungu. It is possible the term Shungu would have spawned from the east of Congo first, coming from the Luba kingdom regions. Notably, within the Luba kingdom, there were Sungus who were intermediaries between the people and the king, who undoubtedly would have been the patrons on deciding a subject's destiny and freedom. Consider one of Tipu Tip's installed chiefs was referred to by the Baluba Songe title, Sungu. Knowing this title is consistent with the system of patrons being the decider of one's destiny and freedom reflects the circumstances the Baluba Songe found themselves in after they were invaded by the Sultan Swahili Arabs. The populations who were being brought into the Tetela Sankuru districts from Luebo around the year 1910 would have included patrons understood as Shongos of the Kuba kingdom. On the basis the Shongo is one who redeems, the Shongo would have had an equivalent position to redeem. Though there is no proof, it is possible the meaning of Sungu and Shongo was thought to be interchangeable rather than just two different pronunciations. Do factor in the 19th century, maniema, Songo was also a title for Baluba Songe rulers in possession of axes rather than throwing knives. Hence Gasongo. The later Nsapu chief had the name Nkusa Mulumba. Do consider another term for God amongst the Baluba of Katanga is Kalumba, and Nsapu means axe. This is all stated so you understand those in possession of sharp objects or blacksmiths were perhaps seen as or projected as a major component of a supreme deity. I stand to be contested and corrected on all these statements, but the psychosis of the populations at this time shows me the terms for a supreme deity varied according to attributes of the supreme deity, which was represented in humans as gods walking on earth. If a ruler on earth was a Shongo, then it may have been interpreted as a component of the supreme deity, also referred to as Shongo. Here is another thought. Equally as the Sultan Swahili Arabs would have possessed power and prestige to then be referred to as a Shungu, how do you think the invading Europeans looked to the indigenous populations when the invading Europeans were parading the lands with authority, sending commands, enslaving and allegedly freeing people through the system of evangelization? Some may have guessed the invading Europeans would have also been referred to as Sungu, as their actions paralleled with one in charge of redeeming. To not confuse the term Muzungu, which today appears to be an exclusive reference to foreigners or pale Europeans through various places in Africa, the case I have brought forth is exclusive to today's DR Congo interiors, radiating from the Luba kingdom. Do consider when the Tetela people began to understand that invading Europeans are invaders and they are there to destroy them, they began to call them Asambala, which was initially a term exclusive to the Sultan Swahili Arabs. This is just to highlight the term Sungu or Shungu was first synonymous with power and prestige, and perhaps grew exclusive to mixed race people or them pale people, or what Europeans described as yellow people, who possessed power and prestige. For those who watch part 8 may already know, around the year 1911, the term Nzambi would have been introduced to the Tetela and Kiluba speakers of the region as part of the then colonial evangelization scheme. It was reported that Tetela were not allowed to independently read the Bible until around the 1930s to 1940s. When today's Tetela began reading the Old Testament, they gained an interest with the term eternal, which to the Tetela translated as Lutuya Laka, which means that will be, or it is what it is, or I am that I am. This is all mentioned so you are aware how easy it was for references to a supreme deity to shift from one name to another via means of trade or conquest. Thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for parts 12 entitled Kasai's Rubber Company.
Bataba Basonge nel lota kukilo to babakantu to jemye enu mono yimukumbe no wenu mindota buwa wikasha Songe mukalanga bafuele bilamba bele shita kukile ikuno Songe mukelenge musonge fumu kwa bota panwa bufika yikuwenyi Subukamba bulanda susala yakaba munda musonge takutwa inkinemo Lumpungu kaumbu bachinwa na basungu kwetu kukabinda kala Alukusabyo byokuwano andukula Nandeka kuyimba basonge Kuyimba kwa bubenka batumbilwe kunyimba Tabakwile kumwilo kuno Safo sesele mutende manamana Taile mkalunga nyembo Sukadimba yongomba mwila ande Taile mkalunga nyembo Nango ya lusombe nyimba mwikale mwe Taile mkalunga nyembo Kasongo ntungo shana kumbalwe Ndombalu keku kabinda kapesa Sampumwe kuna mkwabo kabongwe tabakokele kwimba bayayi Wende mkwaki monga na sabu kilolo mbashale upenka wabo Kambilwa kungu njakeba Oitaba mwikale wadidi Ayababo Ay Ajo d'histoire Titu bana lukule bana ibaya ya Basonge mikando yikukatanga ibanta pa kuishimba batabo Basonge mikando yikukatanga ibanta pa kuishimba ya munda Basonge kukatanga mboba kale mfungu abakufilwa yitubonye bungulube bafwe Bena Rwanda tamba kileyi Basonge bafuile kukatanga bungi na bafwe mwishinda nasala na nyota byobyo bitombo kwetu akuna mumusonge tamwile kukatanga musungu bamulobele kwanga tula yinya binyele benye Bena katanga bakuba mkone kwa Kuba nikuyila Basonge kwetu kukabinda na kusenteli na kulusambo Batetela na baluba nkutwela mwishinda tungwenda kwa changa Basungu bangoshi ya kukolweshi kusonje bashele kwanga mulenda mbo na mkwabo mutamba kulombo la mashini mpana mingochi akubadia bose nkabenyi Bena katanga babalwishise bintu byabo Kyungu wakumwasa ya kalegena binangu takuluba kyotintunya tokanya mwenye kuisa tokanya mwenye pikale fukudia yedya lwendo limune nampiane Kombe mpano bina bine nushala numutetekesa ulenda baluka kwabo bakwetu Bena katanga nushale nwanga balenge kwenu asomwa kubisambika mwela solo oita bamwikale bwanini ayababo ai mwandanka mpaswila lungula na mondwe taunyanga sunkukala ngoma ya nushiyaya kibunge Basonge ngoma ya Basokin ngoma ya nushiyaya tayibusonge mbyanye nonya yebongo musonge lana mwande fungirwa baba Bena mona kayembe mpeyi mkwangu solo kalumba yawa mwilande tumbaki mwana mbolusese yawa mwikane kimfungo sakala mshale kwitumba musanga mwambe mwina mpali Mwe bingi mwina maleka Songo ngolomonya babula mukankala kaya mbutwe bondo nyimuntu akudimbi ilala kadi mwefina mwikale mwengo tundaba ngongola njele yawa ya Kayende yo mukoko ya pampanya Kambido kungunji ya keva ngoma Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Ngoma tayende yo mukoko ya pampanya Muchichika bamba na nkole kibonje Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Kitale kia Basokin na kyakobo la mulamba Na ya mpanya kalume kapitale Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Basa wa Basokin yingwa kalombo yo mitumbia Basokin njalwa kila ngongo Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Eidia Basokin njanye mojitenge Na kalunga msongela na kabambi mkongole Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Aikamango mayobe katanga ya mutumba Mwana kukadiamba na biondo Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Mututa yimbi katanga Ne mutoko nyimbi kwa lusunami Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Ayayo Sebe mayenga mwanda muna Amuka kisokola Mwokola mponda Hey Hey
papa mama, yes, toto tombole.